Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, 6:47 in the morning. Gray sky pressing down on gray tarmac. A ground crew in orange vests moving between aircraft the way they have 10,000 times before. Concourse B, a woman stands in front of a mirror. 62 years old. Navy's her. A small gold brooch at her lapel, the kind of thing most people wouldn't notice, which is exactly why he chose it. 3 years before the pancreatic cancer took him in 11 weeks. She adjusts it. 1 finger, 1 second. Okay, she says quietly. 1 more day. Down the corridor, a flight attendant checks her uniform in a different mirror. Neat hair, practice smile. 6 years of doing this. 2 closed complaint records. Nobody ever mentioned she has done this before. Know yet whose seat she is about to walk toward. She does not know that the aircraft waiting at the gate, the one she has boarded 100 times, has a tail number that begins with the letters M and N. She does not know what those letters stand for. She had built a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She had outlasted men who bet against her in boardrooms and courtrooms and every kind of room in between. She had survived grief that should have broken her, the kind that arrives without warning and stays without permission. On Tuesday morning in Atlanta, none of that was going to matter to the woman in the uniform. Yet the brooch was small, oval, gold-plated, the kind of thing most people would walk past without noticing, which was exactly why Edward had chosen it. Pressed it into her palm in a rainy parking lot in Savannah, Georgia, a weekend trip they'd taken for no reason other than they felt like going somewhere together. With that look on his face, that meant he wasn't going to explain himself, and she wasn't going to ask him to. 25 years of marriage had built that particular language between them, the look, the press of a hand, the thing that didn't need words because the words would only make it smaller. 3 years ago, pancreatic cancer took him in 11 weeks. 11 weeks from diagnosis to gone. And the worst part, one of the worst parts, because grief had many worse parts, she had learned, was as that 11x felt both impossibly fast and unbearably long at the same time. She still couldn't say the word widowed out loud without feeling the floor shift, so she wore the brooch every flight, every meeting, every morning when she stood in front of a mirror and had to locate herself again in the person looking back. She stood now in the women's restroom at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, Concourse B, 6C7 in the morning. The fluorescent lights were doing nobody any favors. She adjusted the brooch on the lapel of her navy blazer, looked at herself for one long moment. 62 years old, not fragile, not finished, not anything like what sometimes assumes. They saw a woman her age standing alone in an airport at dawn and said quietly, to herself, to Edward, to whoever might be listening, okay. 1 more day. She walked out into the terminal. Grace Monroe did not look like money. That was deliberate. The navy blazer was 4 years old, well-made but branded, dark trousers, low-heeled shoes built for distance, not for impressing anyone. A single leather bag, dark brown, chosen years ago because it had the right number of pockets and the right dimensions for overhead storage and for no other reason. The only jewelry she wore was a watch, practical, water-resistant, the kind a person buys to tell time, and the brooch. She did not travel with an assistant. She did not use the carrier's premium check-in lounge, though her status entitled her to it. She did not announce herself to gate agents or upgrade herself into visibility. This was not humility, it was methodology. Because Grace Monroe had spent 24 years building Monroe Aerospace Holdings, LLCs, which currently owned and leased more than 70 commercial aircraft operating across North America, on a principle she had arrived at early and never abandoned. You cannot fix what you will not look at directly. And you cannot look at a system directly if the system knows you're watching. So she flew commercial. She stood in the regular security line. She bought coffee from the same terminal kiosks as everyone else and tipped the woman behind the counter who had clearly been awake since 4 in the morning and was still managing a genuine smile. In economy sometimes, business class sometimes, first class sometimes. Different routes, different carriers, different times of day, watching everything. Noting what worked, what didn't, what made a passenger feel like a human being in transit versus cargo being processed. The findings were not always comfortable. She had come to believe that the uncomfortable findings were the valuable ones. Today, she was flying first class to Chicago O'Hare. Monroe Aerospace held a minority institutional stake in the parent company of this particular carrier, which meant today's a board meeting, which she had requested, structured, and would be chairing a significant of, concerned the future of the same airline she was about to board as an ordinary ticketed passenger. Purchased the ticket herself 3 days ago. Directly through the carrier's website, Seat 2A, round trip. She had the confirmation number committed to memory. She did not anticipate needing it. She found a seat near the gate window and settled with her bag in her lap. Outside, the tarmac was gray and flat under a dishwater sky. A ground crew in orange vests moved between aircraft with the quiet precision of people who had done this 10,000 times and would do it 10,000 more. She watched them for a moment. Then she looked around the gate area. A young mother nearby was managing a stroller, a carry-on bag, a toddler, with strong opinions about sitting still and a boarding pass held between her teeth. Grace stood, walked over, held out her hand for the pass, took the juice cup the toddler was waving like a small flag. 30 seconds, maybe 35. The stroller folded. The young mother exhaled with the particular relief of someone who had been holding a lot together for a long time. "You," she said. "The simple kind. The kind that means it." Grace handed back the pass, walked back to her seat. An older gentleman across from her had dropped his newspaper. She picked it up, returned it. He nodded. She nodded. Neither of them felt the need to perform the exchange into anything larger than it was. She took out her book. A biography she'd savoring slowly, the way you eat something very good and don't want it to end. Found her page. Over the PA, a voice announced boarding for Group 1 on flight MR12472 to Chicago O'Hare. She put the book away. Adjusted the brooch, walked to the gate. The jet bridge smelled like recycled air and 15 years of anxious feet, the way jet bridges always do. Grace walked it at an unhurried pace, not slow enough to inconvenience anyone behind her, not fast enough to signal urgency she didn't feel, and stepped through the aircraft door into the first-class cabin. 6 rows, cream-colored seats with enough space to think, soft overhead lighting, the low hum of auxiliary systems. She found 2A. Window seat, left side, stowed her bag in the overhead compartment, settled into the seat, pulled out the biography, found her page again. The brooch caught the light briefly as she adjusted against the headrest. She did not look up from the book. She did not look around to see who was watching. She was already in the way of someone practiced at finding small pockets of quiet wherever they appear, mostly inside the pages. She had no reason to look up. She had done nothing wrong. She heard the footsteps stop beside her row. She finished the sentence she was reading, about a woman in 1910 who had been told by nearly everyone around her what was and was not possible, and who had proceeded as though she hadn't heard them, and then looked up. Attendant, standing in the aisle, was in her early 30s. Neat uniform, hair pulled back, an expression that had been arranged to look professional and was almost making it there. Her name badge said Amber T. Her eyes had already finished their assessment of Grace Rowe. Grace recognized the speed of it, the specific quality of it. She had been assessed like this before, in hotel lobbies, in conference rooms, in restaurants, where she'd held a reservation and been redirected toward a table near the kitchen. Assessment that happens in 3 seconds and arrives dressed as procedure. I'm sorry, Amber's voice was pitched at a particular frequency, audible to the rows nearby, not loud enough to be confrontational on the record. This cabin is reserved for first-class passengers. Question, not a verification. A conclusion, dressed in apologetic language. Grace looked at her steadily, then reached into her blazer pocket and produced her boarding pass. Extended it without comment. Amber took it. Grace watched her read it, watched her turn it over, watched her hold it at a slightly different angle, as though the angle might produce a different result. What the boarding pass said was, Seat 2A First Class, Flight MR1247, what it had always said, what it would continue to say regardless of how it was held. Returned it, not placed back, returned in the way you return something you've decided has no value, a loose one-handed motion. Boarding pass drifted down and landed on the tray table with a small, flat sound. Small, but Grace heard exactly what it contained. Photo ID? Amber asked. Still smooth, still surface-level professional. We've been dealing with third-party booking issues on this route. Purchased this ticket directly through your website, Grace said. Her voice was even, not loud, not performing patience. Actually patient, the way you are when you have nothing to prove and have learned that proving things to the wrong audience is a waste of a good argument. A sound that committed to nothing, neither agreement nor doubt, just a sound filling space. The verbal equivalent of a door held slightly ajar so you can't tell if it's open or closed. Amber did not move on. She stood beside the row with the particular quality of presence that is its own form of pressure, the occupation of space without stated purpose, the implication that the space be occupied until something changed. And Grace understood, from experience, what was supposed to change. She was supposed to feel the accumulated weight of being looked at. to calculate the social cost of continued stillness against the apparent cost of standing up, to decide that the path of least resistance was the path that required her to move. She did not move. Row 1's Garrett Stowe was already reaching for his phone, 55 years old, gray at the temples. Solid professional confidence of someone who had spent decades in rooms where his judgment was rarely challenged. He worked in aviation insurance, a different corner of the industry, though the same general geography. Traveled first class reflexively, without thinking about it, the way you breathe. He had processed the situation in the time it took him to look up from his phone. Woman in a seat she probably shouldn't be in. Flight attendant addressing the matter. Standard situation. He hit record. Not aggressively, just because it was interesting. Because he had 4 minutes before general boarding, nothing pressing to read, and complete certainty about what he was looking at. He pointed the camera at the woman in 2A. He would spend a considerable amount of time later thinking about that certainty. How quickly it had arrived, about what it had been built on. Row 1D, Evelyn Marsh, was 72 years old and wearing a cardigan the color of old roses. She leaned slightly toward her husband, Gerald, 74, somewhat hard of hearing, the kind patient man who had learned over 48 years of marriage that most things his wife said were worth catching, even when he couldn't quite hear them, and murmured something close to his ear. Gerald nodded without fully catching it. What Evelyn had said was, "They always try this." She said it the way you say something that has calcified into reflex. Something you believe without having examined it recently. Something that feels like observation but has over time become something else entirely. Turned back to the window, the tarmac, the gray sky. Row 3B. Judge Renata Okafor, retired United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit, 22 years on the federal bench, set her book down. She was 68 years old, compact, and still with the quality of attention that develops when you spend 2 decades listening to people under pressure and building toward conclusions that have to hold. She had a knee that complained in cold weather, which was most weather these days, and she had made her peace with it. She looked at Grace in 2A. She looked at Amber standing in the aisle. She recognized the shape of what was happening immediately. Because she was prescient, because she had been in it, not on an aircraft, but in restaurants where she held a reservation, in courthouses where she was supposed to be among colleagues, in 100 ordinary spaces where the question of whether she belonged was raised by someone who had not examined their authority to raise it. She knew what it felt like from the inside. She watched. Row 4C. Marcus Webb was 47 years old, a software engineer from Houston, traveling to Chicago for a conference. Graded from an economy window to this business class aisle seat, because his knees had opinions about long flights, opinions that had grown louder in the past few years. He was by training and by temperament a man who thought carefully before speaking, who chose his moments, who had learned, in a lifetime of being a black man moving through professional spaces, that not every battle was worth the cost and that wisdom meant knowing the difference. Watching. Since Amber stopped at row 2, he had seen the boarding pass taken and returned. He had heard the sound it made when it landed on the tray table. Small sound. He understood its full meaning. He shifted in his seat, said nothing yet, but something in him had already made a decision that the rest of him was just catching up to. Amber had not moved on. She was still in the aisle, still in that position of presence without stated purpose that was its own quiet escalation. "I'm going to need to verify your booking with my supervisor," she said. "There have been some seating discrepancies in this cabin today." "What kind of discrepancies?" "I can't go into the details. I see." Grace's tone was neither accepting nor resistant. "Simply noting, if you could just give me a moment to." "I can give you the confirmation number," Grace said. "If verification is the goal, that would help." Amber paused. "That won't be necessary right now." Which was a strange thing to say. If verification was genuinely the purpose, a confirmation number would be directly relevant. The only scenario in which it was unnecessary was one in which verification was not actually the purpose, Grace understood. She looked at Amber with the same steady attention she had maintained since the beginning. Not combative, not pleading, just fully present. The kind of presence that does not fill silence with explanation and does not absorb pressure by bending toward it. It was this quality of unshifting stillness that had begun to make Amber Tate uneasy. She had done variations of this before. Not always this explicitly, but versions of it on this route, in this cabin, with passengers who fit a profile she had built without ever sitting down to examine it. had always resolved in the same direction, because the whole architecture of the situation worked in her favor. The uniform, the authority, the social pressure, the simple calculus of conflict avoidance. People tired. People weighed the disruption against their destination and decided moving was easier than staying. The woman in seat 2A had not moved. Not looked like she was going to. There was something in that stillness that Amber did not have a name for yet. Something that made her feel for the first time that she might not be the most prepared person in this exchange. She reached for her phone, and Grace, who had been reading people across tables and across rooms for 24 years, understood in the same moment what was happening. Verification, not supervisor contact. The red indicator appeared in the corner of Amber's screen. Amber positioned it at a downward angle, her expression shifting into something more relaxed, more practiced. Performance for an audience she was building in real time. Little bit of situation up here in first class this morning, she said, low enough to seem casual and loud enough to be heard clearly. The viewer count started climbing. 11, 24, 37. Grace looked at the phone, then at Amber, then back at her own tray table. She made a decision in the space of one breath. She did not react visibly to the live stream. What she did privately was take one long breath in and release it slowly. Because she had received a message 3 minutes ago from Darnell, her assistant, who was 29 years old and methodically good at his job. The message contained a name, and attached to the name, pulled from public complaint records Darnell had been searching since Grace's first text to him upon boarding, was a summary that she had read once and then read again. Formal complaint, filed 6 months ago. A passenger on a flight from Memphis to Atlanta first class. A black woman traveling alone who had been made to feel, the complaint used this exact word, unwelcome. Complaint had been submitted, reviewed, marked as resolved. The flight attendant's name in the documentation was Amber Tate. The passenger was 58 years old. A retired schoolteacher. Her name was Denise. She was Grace Monroe's younger sister. Grace had not known. Denise had mentioned it months later, almost as a side note in a different conversation, framed as nothing much. When Grace had asked why she hadn't said anything at the time, Denise had been quiet for a moment and then said, I didn't want to make a fuss. I didn't think anyone would believe me. I didn't want to make a fuss. 30 years in a classroom, shaping minds. 3 kids raised largely on her own. A woman who had never, in Grace's memory, asked for anything she had not genuinely earned the right to need. Didn't want to make a fuss. Grace set her phone face down on the tray table. She looked straight ahead at the seat back in front of her. And something settled into place in her chest, not anger, because anger was too volatile, too dependent on the other person's response, but the harder, quieter thing that comes after anger has been processed and refined. The thing that does not need an audience and does not need to be heard right now. She would be heard when the moment was right. Row 4C, Marcus Webb had been watching the phone with the red indicator. He had been watching Amber's posture, the performance of it, the way she was slightly angled toward her own screen. Watched Grace's face when she understood what was happening, had watched the absence of reaction, the perfect controlled absence. It happened the way things happen when a person has been talking themselves out of something for too long and finally gets tired of the talking. Not impulsive, almost the opposite of impulsive, a decision that had been building since the boarding pass landed on the tray table and was now simply complete. He kept his voice steady. Not confrontational, just present. I saw this passenger's boarding pass when she walked on. Clearly said first class, seat 2A. I read it. Every head in the forward cabin turned. Amber looked at him with the cool assessment of someone recalibrating a situation. Sir, this isn't your concern. I think it is. Still quiet, not escalating. When something isn't right, I think everyone in the room is a little bit concerned. Sir, I need you to take your seat. He held for one more moment, looked at Grace. Their eyes met briefly. An acknowledgement passed between them that didn't need language. I see what's happening here. You're not alone in it. Down, did not put his phone away, opened the voice memo app, pressed record in row 3B. Renata Okafor had not moved. Her book was fully closed, both hands resting on the cover, her attention entirely on the aisle. She was building in the organized way of persons who had spent a career building arguments that had to withstand examination. Logging, noting, arriving at a conclusion that she was nearly ready to state. Officer Ray Dunbar appeared at the forward cabin entrance. 45 years old, airport security. He moved through without urgency, assessed the room, and settled his gaze on Amber. What's the situation? Passenger in the wrong seat, Amber said, refusing to cooperate with the verification process. Dunbar looked at Grace. Grace met his eyes, said nothing. She had not raised her voice, had not made threats, had not created any disturbance beyond sitting quietly in a seat she purchased and declining to leave it. Heavy footsteps at bridge behind Dunbar, a different weight to them, the kind that takes up more space. Beck Donovan, senior manager, pushed through the cabin door with the energy of someone who had formed a concentration before entering the room. 50 years old, broad-shouldered, 15 years in airline customer management, the kind of professional certainty that can be useful when it's calibrated correctly and catastrophic when it isn't. The cabin, that found Grace, found Amber, found the phone with its small red indicator. He calculated quickly in the way of someone who had handled hundreds of these situations and believed he could read them on arrival. Read this one wrong. What do we have? He said to Amber. Passenger in 2A, disputed boarding claim, not cooperating. Donovan approached the row with the brisk efficiency of resolution. Ma'am, I'm the senior ground manager on this flight. I'll need to see your boarding pass and a photo ID. Grace produced both, held them out. He took them. He read the boarding pass, looked at the passport, Dr. Grace Monroe. He stood with that name for just a fraction of a moment. Something shifted at the back of his professional memory, a flicker of a connection he couldn't surface, and then he pushed past it. Departure slot to protect. Your booking history with this carrier shows some irregularities, he said, smooth, authoritative. It's designed to sound like information while containing none. What irregularities, specifically? Grace asked. A pause, slightly too long. Our records show some inconsistencies I need to run through the central system. I purchased this ticket 3 days ago. Through your website, I have the confirmation number available. That won't tell me what I need to know. Grace looked at him. He looked at her. And what Vic Donovan saw was a woman showing none of the signs he had learned to associate with a situation going his way. No nervousness, no over-explanation, no reaching for her phone to demonstrate something, no visible calculation of the social cost of resistance. Stillness. Set total stillness. He read it as bluff. It was the worst professional misreading of his career. He did not know that yet. I'm going to need to ask you to deplane while we complete verification, he said. We can rebook you on the next available, Mr. Donovan. Her voice was the same as it had been since the beginning, unhurried even. I'm waiting for the captain. PA system clicked. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're going to experience a brief hold before departure. Crew, please pause all boarding preparations. Donovan's head came up. He had not requested a hold. He looked toward the cockpit. Back at the woman in seat 2A, who had heard the incident and, in response, reached for her book, found her per page, and waited. Because Grace Monroe had learned something a long time ago, longer ago than any of the contracts or the company or the boardrooms, longer ago than Monroe Aerospace, in a small house in Baltimore with a mother who worked nights and a father who drove long hauls and came home smelling like diesel and road and pressed his hand to her head like a benediction. She had learned that the people who underestimate you are not doing you a favor. They are doing something. They are showing you exactly where the gap lives, the gap between what they see and what is actually there. She knew what was there. She pressed her finger gently to the brooch at her lapel. 1 touch, 1 second. Turns the page. Captain James Whitfield, 30 years aviation behind him. 30 years of instrument failures and rough weather and passengers who and engines that produced sounds they were not designed to produce. 30 years of walking out of the cockpit with his shoulders level and his face composed because the people behind him needed a uniform to look trustworthy. 6 months from now, he would retire. He had been approaching that date, that with something that felt mostly like relief and partially like the quiet grief of letting go of the only identity he had worn consistently since his late 20s. Not anticipated that his second-to-last year would produce this particular Tuesday. He'd heard the situation report from his co-pilot. Passenger dispute in the forward cabin. Verification issue. Senior manager on scene. He'd told the tower they needed a brief hold and walked out expecting something familiar. A misunderstanding. Something resolvable in 3 minutes. He stopped at the edge of the first-class cabin and took it in. Tate. Phone in hand, red indicator visible. Vic Donovan standing with his clipboard at an angle that communicated authority. Officer Dunbar off to one side, professional but clearly uncertain whose instructions to follow. A cabin full of phones pointed in various directions. In 60-something, navy blazer, a small gold brooch at the lapel, book in her lap held but not open. Straight, not from tension but from habit. Eyes that assessed him at a single glance when he entered, not hostile, not imploring. watching. The quality of her stillness stopped him before he had consciously processed why, as he had seen a lot of people under pressure. He knew the difference between someone controlling their panic and someone who had no panic to control because they already knew how this ended. This woman knew how it ended. He crossed the cabin to row 2. "Tell me what's happening," he said to Donovan. Donovan gave the summary. Boarding pass disputed. Verification irregularities. Passenger uncooperative. Whitfield listened without interrupting. Then he looked at the woman in 2A. "May I see your documents, ma'am?" Of course. She produced both boarding pass and passport with the easy efficiency of someone who had been waiting for the right person to ask. Took them. "Read the boarding pass. Read the passport. Dr. Grace Monroe." He stood with the name, turned it. Monroe Aerospace, 3 years ago, 11 days that had come closer to ending this carrier's eastern operations than the public had ever been told. Maintenance certification crisis. He'd been one of 7 pilots asked to fly routes using aircraft sourced through an emergency lease arrangement, well-maintained planes that appeared on the tarmac with minimal explanation and flew exactly as they should. Co-pilot had said quietly, "These are Monroe birds." Whitfield had made a mental note and moved on because there were other things to think about and the planes were good, and that was what mattered at the time. Monroe Aerospace. He looked at the passport again. "Dr. Grace Monroe." He handed the documents back. "Thank you," he said. He looked at Donovan. Something in his expression had shifted, not dramatic, just a degree or two of recalibration. Kind a pilot makes when updated information arrives. Donovan didn't know how to read him well enough to catch it. "Need a few minutes," Whitfield said. "Captain, the tower has already noted the hold. Vic, one word. The kind that ends conversations." Back to the cockpit. While Whitfield was gone, Garrett Stowe had been doing 2 things simultaneously. Recording. The phones angled toward row 2A. Reading his comment feed, which had begun moving faster than he could track. One comment had stopped him. Verified account. "Aviation insurance sector. His sector." The comment read, "Hold on, is that Grace Monroe? Monroe Aerospace?" He looked at that comment, at the woman in the seat, then back at the comment. He knew the name Monroe Aerospace. Everyone in his corner of the industry knew it. Knowing a company name and placing the face of its founder were different things. He opened his quarterly risk portfolio report, the one from 2 months ago, filed and mostly forgotten. Scroll to the institutional partner section. Monroe Aerospace Holdings, LLC, primary contact, Dr. Grace Monroe, founder and chief executive officer. Photograph. He looked at it. Then at seat 2A, he lowered his phone slowly. He had not yet fully processed what this meant. He knew enough to know it was significant. He knew enough to know his clip, already posted, already moving, was going to look very different to the people watching it once the full picture emerged. He did not yet know what to do about that. He put his phone face down on his knee. He sat with it. Pit door opened, and Whitfield walked back into the cabin. Row 1D. Evelyn Marsh had been trying to place the judge's face since she stood up. She knew it. She was certain she knew it. The specific architecture of the features, the particular quality of the posture. Something about the economy of the gestures. And then it arrived, the way memory arrives when you stop pushing at it, sideways, without announcement. 28 years ago. A civil dispute that had come close to ending her family's small property management business. 3 years of litigation, more in legal fees than the business had earned in the previous 5 years. A case that had felt at its lowest point genuinely unwinnable. A judge, newer to the bench than younger, with that same quality of attention, who had read the full record with a precision that cut through the accumulated confusion of 3 years of filings and found the actual center of it. And ruled accordingly. Evelyn had sat in that courtroom and wept, not at the ruling alone, at being seen. Having the actual situation recognized by someone with the authority to name it. The judge had been Renata Okafor. Evelyn looked at her now, standing in the aisle of a first-class cabin, speaking on behalf of a woman she had never met. Evelyn looked at the woman she had never met. Seat 2A, navy blazer, small gold brooch, book in her lap. Sitting in a seat she had purchased with her own money on a flight she had every right to take, being asked to account for herself in ways that had nothing to do with what was actually in question. Evelyn thought about what she had whispered to Gerald 40 minutes ago when this woman sat down. They always try this. With those 4 words, the way you sometimes sit with something uncomfortable, without flinching away from it, without softening it into something easier to hold. She let them mean what they meant. Let herself look at where they had come from and what they had assumed and how quickly they had arrived. Her hands, folded in her lap, felt suddenly unfamiliar, as though she were holding something she needed to examine before deciding what to do with it. She looked at Gerald. He was watching the judge, his hearing aids doing their imperfect work, catching fragments. He didn't notice her looking. Looked back at Grace Monroe, and something turned over in Evelyn Marsh, slow, a little painful, the way real things tend to be, and landed somewhere new. Garrett Stowe had lowered his phone, not turned it off, lowered it so it rested on his knee, still recording, while he did something he hadn't been doing before, thinking. 47,000 followers on X, mostly aviation and finance professionals. The clip had gone up 12 minutes ago with a hashtag he'd chosen in about 2 seconds. He could see from the corner of his screen that it had been picked up by a couple of accounts with large followings. The comments were moving too fast to track individually, but one had stopped him. Verified account. Aviation insurance sector, his specific corner of it. The comment read, "Hold on, is that Grace Monroe, Monroe Aerospace?" He had looked at that comment and then looked at the woman in 2A and then looked at the comment again. Monroe Aerospace. He pulled up the quarterly risk portfolio report on his phone, the one from 2 months ago that he had read and filed and mostly not thought about since. Scroll to the institutional partner section. Monroe Aerospace Holdings, LLC. Primary contact, Dr. Grace Monroe, founder and chief executive officer. There was a photograph. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at the woman in 2A. He looked at the clip he had posted, at the hashtag, at the comments accumulating under it from people who had even less information than he'd had and were constructing a story out of the angle of his camera. He felt something move through him that was not comfortable and was as accurate. He had been in this business long enough to know that the market for his kind of work ran on reputation, on being someone whose judgment was trusted, on being, in the language of his industry, someone with good instincts. He had just publicly demonstrated the opposite of good instincts. With that, for a moment, the full weight of it, without looking away from it. Then he looked at his phone. At the clip, at his own reflection in the dark border of the screen. In the cockpit, the door opened. James Whitfield walked back into the cabin. Whitfield had been on the phone for 4 minutes. One call to the carrier's operations center. Question about the registration on aircraft MN11247 and the name associated with the current active lease agreement. The answer had come back in 11 seconds in the flat, efficient language of someone reading from a database. Monroe Aerospace Holdings, LLC, active multi-year agreement. He had thanked them, hung up, sat for a moment in the cockpit with the gray Atlanta morning pressings against the wind's screen and 30 years of aviation running through the back of his mind. Never, in all of it, been in a situation where the passenger being asked to leave owned the aircraft. Back into the cabin and said, "Everyone step back from row 2 now." His voice was not loud. Was the voice he used when a thing was decided and the time for discussion had concluded, and it had the quality of a door closing firmly. Barr stepped back. Donovan stepped back, blinking, recalibrating, his clipboard dropping a few inches. Amber, at the rear of the cabin, took one involuntary step backward. Whitfield walked to row 2, stood beside the seat. He was aware of every phone in the cabin, of the judge standing in row 3, of the weight of the moment in a way that felt different from any other professional moment he had been aware of. "Mr. Monroe," he said, and his voice privately meant something more than the words. "I've confirmed the aircraft registration, and I've confirmed who you are. I owe you an apology on behalf of this crew, and I want to offer it clearly." Grace looked up at him. She did not rush to fill the space he was making, did not say "it's fine," or "thank you," or any of the things that would have allowed the moment to move past what it was. It be what it was. What do you need from me?" Whitfield asked. It came out as a statement. A surrender in the good sense, the sense of someone who understood what the situation was and was willing to stand in it correctly. Grace Monroe set her book on the tray table. She looked at Whitfield, then at Donovan, who was standing very still with the expression of a man watching a bridge he had crossed collapse behind him. At Amber, at the rear of the cabin, then back at Whitfield. She touched the brooch briefly, one finger, one sextet, the same gesture she had made every flight for 3 years, and said, "I need you to call VP Conrad Reeves. And I think we should put him on speaker so everyone who was present for this incident can hear the conversation that happens next." Donovan's clipboard hit his side. The cabin waited, and Grace Monroe, who had built an empire on the principle of looking at things directly, looked directly at what was about to happen. She had known since she sat down. She had always known. Conrad Reeves picked up on the second ring, which told Whitfield something. VP of Operations, who picks up on the second ring at 7 in the morning, has already been called by someone else, which meant word had moved faster than the aircraft was going to. Whitfield put it on speaker, held the phone out where the forward cabin could hear it. The auxiliary power unit hummed beneath everything, that constant low sound of a machine waiting to do what it was built for. Captain Whitfield. Reeves's voice came through with the tightness of a man managing his breathing very carefully. Give me the situation. I've Dr. Grace Monroe of Monroe Aerospace in seat 2A. She was asked to deplane. She did not deplane. Confirm the aircraft registration and the current lease agreement through operations. A pause, not a long pause, but the kind that has a lot of activity inside it. Is she on the line? She is. Dr. Monroe. The register of his voice changed completely, dropped the operational briskness, replaced it with something that was working very hard to be appropriate to the moment. I'm Conrad Reeves. I want to begin by saying, Reeves, Grace's voice, quiet, unhurried, arriving in the cabin the way a well-placed word arrives, not loud, just accurate. I know who you are. I'd like us to talk about what happens next rather than what's already happened. The what's already happened is documented. We can address it in sequence. A breath on the line. Of course, he said, whatever you need. 3 words. Whatever you need. They landed in the cabin with the weight of a complete reversal. Not because they were dramatic, they were said plainly, without theater, but because of what they meant in the architecture of everything that had happened in the previous 40 minutes. Donovan heard them. He was standing 2 rows back, clipboard at his side, and he heard them with the particular clarity of a person who has just understood, fully and without remaining doubt, the magnitude of the error he has made. It did not change much, but something behind it went very quiet, the way a machine goes quiet when it loses power. Tate, at the rear of the cabin, heard them too. The live stream was still running. She had stopped being aware of it sometime in the last few minutes. Meant 200. And some viewers had just heard Conrad Reeves say it ever you need to the woman Amber had tried to remove from first class. She looked at the phone in her hand as though she had never seen it before. Then slowly, with the movements of someone who has run out of other options, she ended the stream. 219 viewers, final count. The number sat in the corner of her screen for a moment before disappearing. Grace did not adjust her posture or her tone when Reeves came on the line. She spoke the same way she had spoken since Amber first stopped at her row, evenly, without performing either distress or triumph, as though she were in a business meeting that had simply been scheduled at an unusual venue. Before I tell you what I'd like to see happen going forward, she said, I want to make sure the record is complete. Go ahead. Your flight attendant, Miss Tate, opened this incident by questioning the validity of my first-class ticket without cause and without initiating any official verification process. She extended the interaction by requesting additional documentation beyond what your own passenger service manual requires as a first step. Activated a public live stream of the incident while it was ongoing without obtaining consent from me or from any other passenger in the cabin. And she was supported in escalating to a removal order by your senior ground manager, Mr. Donovan, before standard verification through official channels had been completed. She paused. Let each element sit separately. That is not one person having a difficult morning. That is a sequence of procedural failures at multiple levels of your crew structure. Reeves exhaled, 1 breath, audible. You're right, he said, without qualification, without the softening addendum that most people reach for when acknowledging something uncomfortable. You're right. Grace noted it. She noted everything. Additionally, she continued, my assistant has pulled public complaint records this morning. 2 prior formal complaints naming Ms. Tate, both filed, both reviewed, both closed without documented corrective action. Silence on the line. First, Grace said, was filed 18 months ago. A passenger on a Dallas to Atlanta route, first class. A black male passenger, 61 years old, who described being treated as a suspect in a seat he had purchased. The complaint was marked resolved by a supervisor and filed. The second complaint was filed 6 months ago on a Memphis to Atlanta flight. First class, female passenger, 58 years old, retired teacher. She described feeling unwelcome and intimidated into changing seats. Complaint was also marked, resolved, and filed. She did not mention that she knew who the second passenger was. Was not the point right now. The point was the pattern. 2 complaints, 2 closures, nothing documented in between. I'd like you to tell me how that happens. Reeves was quiet for 4 full seconds. The kind of quiet that means someone is not composing a defense, but genuinely contending with something. I wasn't aware of the specifics, he said. I will find out how that happened today. You have my word on that. I appreciate that, and I'd like the investigation to be conducted by someone outside the management chain that processed both closures. Because investigating whether a system of oversight failed by using the same system of oversight is not investigation, it's confirmation. Agreed, I'll arrange for external review. Grace nodded. Not for him, not for the cabin, for herself. Internal registration of something going correctly. Good, she said. Then let's talk about what comes next. In row 1C, Garrett Stowe had put his phone entirely away. Not on his knee this time, in his bag, under the seat in front of him, out of reach. During the 4 minutes Whitfield had been in the cockpit, Stowe had finished what he'd started when he saw that comment. Confirmed Grace Monroe's identity from the risk report photograph, and he had sat with that confirmation the way you sit with something that reframes everything that came before it, not gradually, but all at once, like a photograph developing in reverse. Certain he was recording someone who didn't belong. He now knew with equal certainty that he had been wrong. The wrongness was not a matter of missing information. Exactly, he'd had enough information. He had said simply not looked at her as someone who might belong before deciding that she didn't. Those were not the same thing, and the difference between them was the part he was going to have to sit with for a long time. Was still up. He knew that without checking, the aviation community moved fast, and the post had already been picked up by accounts with larger followings than his. Taking it down would not erase it, but leaving it up without correction would mean something specific about his character, and he had opinions about his character that this morning was currently challenging. A man who apologized easily. He had built a career on being right, on reading situations accurately, on the credibility that came from not making visible errors in judgment. Public correction felt like professional exposure. He understood that this was the wrong way to be thinking about it, and was thinking about it anyway, which was at least honest. Took out his phone, opened X, found the post, started writing underneath it. Not a defensive clarification, not a strategic repositioning. What just actually happened, and what he had gotten wrong, and why the clip should be understood differently than he had framed it. I posted this clip 20 minutes ago because I thought I knew what I was looking at. I was wrong in a way that goes beyond the specifics of this situation. I'm leaving this up because deleting it would be easier than correcting it, and easier is not what this calls for. Once, left it, looked at the headrest in front of him. 23 years in this industry. He prided himself on not being the kind of person who reacted before he understood. He had reached for his phone in 4 seconds. On what basis, exactly? He pressed that question against himself and held it there without softening it. What had he actually seen? A woman in a seat, a flight attendant beside her, the suggestion of a dispute. Was the entirety of what he observed before he had decided he understood it. Everything else had been supplied by something he was going to have to examine closely. Not now, but soon, and honestly, and without the benefit of arriving at a comfortable conclusion, he folded his hands in his lap. Listened to the call with Reeves. Grace let a beat of silence pass after Reeves had agreed on the external review. The discipline of the pause. She had learned it in her earliest board meetings, when she had been the youngest person in the room and the least expected to be there. And she had learned that the people who spoke immediately after a concession were the people who were managing their relief out loud. The people who waited were the people who knew the concession was the beginning, not the end. There are 4 things I'd like to see implemented, she said. I've thought about them carefully, and I'm going to give them to you plainly. I'm listening first. The independent review of complaint records for this route and this crew over the past 2 years. Just the 2 filed complaints. The full record, including complaints that may have been redirected before formal filing. Results reported directly to your board. Done. Second, a passenger incident reporting system that any traveler can access. No account required, no login. A person should be able to report an incident from their phone in 5 minutes and receive a response from someone with actual authority to act on it within 48 hours. I'll have our technology team begin scoping that this week. Third, mandatory recertification for all passenger-facing staff in this carrier on de-escalation and passenger rights protocol. Not an online module, not a self-directed refresher, a structured program with a completion requirement and documented accountability. A brief pause from Reeves. It's a significant undertaking operationally. I know what it is, Grace said. Do it anyway. Another pause, shorter. Agreed. Fourth, she took a breath. This incident, what happened today on this aircraft, in this cabin, becomes a training case study. Used in the recertification program. Unedited, not summarized into something more manageable. It's not softened to protect anyone's institutional comfort. The actual incident as it occurred, with the actual documentation. Because the only way this becomes useful is if it is accurate. The line was quiet for a moment. Last one, Reeves said carefully, will require some internal discussion about, Mr. Reeves. Grace's voice did not change pitch or pace. The incident was live-streamed to over 200 people and recorded on multiple personal devices by passengers who have already posted some of that footage publicly. The incident is not a private matter that requires your discretion about its use. What requires your discretion is what your organization does with it constructively. Asking you to do something constructive. A long pause. Agreed, he said, quieter than before. Grace looked at her hands for a moment. The watch, the boarding pass, tucked back in her blazer pocket, the book on the tray table, her thumb still holding the page she hadn't finished. There's one more thing, she said, and this is not a demand, it's an offer. Go ahead. Monroe Aerospace will fund the development and first-year implementation of the passenger reporting system and the recertification program. Because we're contractually required to. Because I want to make sure these things actually happen and don't become line items that get deprioritized when the quarter gets tight. The line was very quiet, Dr. Monroe, Reeves said, and something had shifted in his voice. Not the professional surface of it, but the thing underneath. Why would you do that? Grace thought about the question the way she thought about questions that deserved a real answer. She thought about a garage in Atlanta in 1998, which was where Monroe Aerospace had started, technically, because it was the only space available. She thought about the termination letter that had come 3 months before, that signed by a man she had respected and trusted, citing reasons that had nothing to do with her work. She thought about the two people who had lent her money for the first lease without asking her to sign anything because they knew her, and that was enough. She thought about every room where someone had looked at her in the first 3 seconds and made a decision about what she was and what she was capable of and what she was likely to do. And she thought about Denise, 58 years old in a first-class seat on a Memphis flight, saying afterward, I didn't want to make a fuss. I didn't think anyone would believe me, because I can, Grace said, and because I remember what it felt like when I couldn't. Because the people who sit in seats like 2A without a company behind them and a lease agreement attached to the aircraft, they deserve the same response. Not a worse one because the math is different. Nobody said anything for a moment. The cabin held it. Whitfield was standing at the edge of the forward galley, holding the phone, listening to all of it. He had 30 years of stories. Weather stories, equipment stories, the Denver landing in 2009 that still came up at training seminars, the bird strike over the Gulf that his co-pilot had written about in an aviation journal. Stories that had weight and shape and the texture of real events. This was going to be the one he told for the rest of his life. Because it was the most dangerous. Not because it required the most technical skill, but because it was the one where the right thing and the easy thing had been, briefly, the opposite of each other. And where he had gotten close enough to the easy thing to be able to see what choosing it would have looked like. Chosen it, barely. He thought about that, about what barely meant, about the distance between getting it right and not getting it right, and how that distance was often thinner than the professional stories made it sound. He looked at Donovan, who was standing 2 rows back and had not spoken in several minutes. Donovan was looking at the floor. Dramatically, not in collapse, just looking at the floor with the expression of a man doing the arithmetic on a decision and arriving repeatedly at the same unwelcome answer. Whitfield looked away from him. That was Donovan's accounting to do, not his. The call with Reeves had been on speaker for 11 minutes. The cabin had been largely silent through it, not the uncomfortable silence of a room holding its breath, but the different silence of a room that is listening because what is being said is worth listening to. Passengers who had been recording had lowered their phones, not from instruction, from the shift in atmosphere that happens when something you were watching as spectacle becomes something else entirely. When Reeves said agreed for the 4th time and the framework of going forward had been established, Grace said, I'll have my legal team in contact with yours by end of day. Like the commitments formalized before I leave Chicago. They'll be ready, Reeves said. Then, after a pause, is there anything else you need from me directly right now? Not right now. Thank you for picking up. She handed the phone back to Whitfield. He ended the call. Okafor had remained standing through all of it. She had the stillness of someone who had spent decades in rooms where leaving early sent the wrong message. She stood until the call was finished, until the formal part of the morning had concluded, and then she sat down with the deliberate care of someone done with ceremony and ready to think. She picked up her book, did not open it, set it back. What she was thinking about was not the morning's draza that was already filed, already being processed in the part of her mind that had spent 22 years processing events into their relevant components. What she was thinking about was what came after. She had spent 3 years since retirement answering the question of what she was now with various unsatisfying versions of the same answer, resting. Reading available for consulting if the right matter arose. She had believed the right matter would announce itself clearly when it arrived. On a Tuesday morning in Atlanta in the form of a woman in a navy blazer sitting in a seat she owned and a system that had tried to remove her from it. Reached into her bag for her pen. The back of her boarding pass was blank. She set it on the tray table and began writing. The particular small, organized handwriting of someone who had made note and dot margins for 22 years and had developed an efficient shorthand for it. She was not writing impressions. She was writing structure, the legal architecture of what an independent passenger advocacy organization would require. Jurisdiction, intake process, relevant federal statutes, the gap between what those statutes required and what carriers were currently doing. She had enough to start a conversation. She realized considerably more than that. Garrett Stowe, who had been composing his correction post during the call, put his phone in his bag. Back in 1C and looked at the headrest in front of him. He thought about reputation, about 23 years of building one. The specific credibility that allows you to walk into a room and have your assessment of a situation taken seriously. Protected that credibility carefully, had believed genuinely that he was a reliable reader of things. He had reached for his phone in 4 seconds. To think about those 4 seconds for a long time, not as punishment, as data, specific, accurate data about a gap between who he believed he was and who he had been at 6:52 on a Tuesday morning. That was probably the most useful thing the morning had given him, which was not a comfortable thought. He was discovering was not the relevant standard. Evelyn Marsh had been looking at her hands for most of the call with Reeves. Because she was uninterested in what was being said, she had heard every word of it, but something had been happening in her during the call that required a different engine turned inward, unglamorous, the kind of work that doesn't make a sound. She had spent 72 years being certain about things, certain about who worked hard and who didn't, about who deserved what they had and who was trying to take something that wasn't theirs. The shape of the world and her place in it and the general reliability of her own instincts. She had walked onto this aircraft at 6:30 in the morning with that certainty intact. She was looking at her hands now because they were familiar, and she needed something familiar, while she contended with the possibility that one of the things she had been most certain about was not certainty at all. Pattern she had absorbed from somewhere over a long time without examining its origins or its accuracy or its cost. Always try this. 4 words, said in the comfortable shorthand of a settled belief. About who, exactly? She pressed the question. Held it. Made herself hold it, instead of softening it into something more comfortable, about women like the one in 2A. Why, because she had seen it before, or thought she had, or had been given to understand that she had by sources she had not questioned. By 1,000 small inheritances she had accepted without auditing. This was not a comfortable thought to be having at 72 years old in a first-class cabin with a federal judge standing in the aisle and a VP of operations on the phone saying whatever you need. Gerald patted her hand. He did that sometimes when he sensed she was somewhere else. He couldn't always hear what was happening, but he had 48 years of practice reading the quality of her silence. She turned her hand over and held his. You okay? He said. Quietly, she thought about it. Working on it, she said. He nodded. He was a patient man. She looked at the back of Grace Monroe's head in seat 2A and at the brooch at her lapel, just visible from this angle. Small, oval, catching the cabin light in a way that was more ordinary than anything about this morning. She thought about Renata Okafor standing in a courtroom 28 years ago, reading the evidence without preconception, and the way that it felt to be on the receiving end of. She thought about what it cost to see something clearly. She decided it was probably less than the cost of not seeing it. She made a decision that she would not tell Gerald about until they were home, and he would listen carefully and then say something that went directly to the center of it, the way he always did. She would call the library Monday morning. In the rear of the cabin, Amber Tate was standing against the galley wall with her arms at her sides and her phone in her pocket, and the live stream ended 219 people ago. The call with Reeves was over. The formal commitments had been made. The independent review had been agreed to. Her name had been in 2 complaint records that Grace Monroe had summarized clearly and without elaboration, because the facts required no elaboration. She was aware that her career, as she had known it, was over, not because someone had said so explicitly yet. The formal process would happen. The external review would happen. The documentation would be gathered and assessed by someone outside the management chain. But she was aware. She was standing in the galley of an aircraft that the woman she had tried to remove owned, and the math was not complicated. What surprised her, and she was going to be surprised by this for a long time afterward, was what she was feeling in addition to the fear and the defensive scrambling, and the part of her that still wanted to argue that she had been doing her job as she understood it. What she was feeling under all of that was something closer to exhaustion, the exhaustion of a person who has been certain about something for a long time and has just run directly into the wall of what that certainty had cost. She was thinking about the Dallas complaint, the older man she had basically no specific memory of, which was itself a piece of information she was not enjoying. She was thinking about the Memphis complaint, a woman she did have a vague memory of, a quiet woman who had moved without arguing, who had seemed at the time to confirm that Amber had been right, who had in fact been moving because she was alone and felt she had no other option. Amber was thinking about what confirmation feels like from the inside, how much it resembles certainty, how little it resembles truth. She heard her name, Miss Tate, Grace Monroe's voice, not cold, not the warmth of forgiveness either, something in between, direct in the way that honest things are direct. Amber looked up. Grace was turned slightly in her seat, looking back toward the galley, not performing the look for the cabin. Just looking. "I'm not the right person to determine the outcome of the review," Grace said. "That will be handled by people whose job it is. But I want to say something to you directly, because you were in this from the beginning and you deserve a direct word." "You didn't move. You were certain this morning," Grace said. "I watched it. The certainty was total, and nobody in this airline structure had ever given you a reason to question it. It is a failure of the organization you work in, a real failure, with real consequences for real people." She paused. "It is also your failure," Grace said. "Both things are true at the same time. The organization failed you by not correcting you. And you failed the people who sat in those seats. The man from Dallas and the woman from Memphis didn't get a conversation about how the system had let you down. Treated as problems to be resolved. Those 2 things can both be true, and they don't cancel each other out." Amber's jaw was tight. Her eyes were not dry. "I'm not telling you this to extend the punishment," Grace said. "I'm telling you because I think you're standing back there trying to figure out what you did and how wrong it was, and I want you to have an accurate answer instead of a comfortable one." Turned back to face forward. That was all. No verdict, no sentence, no theatrical conclusion. Just the truth stated plainly, and then the space to do something with it. Stood in the galley for a long moment after that, not moving, not reaching for her phone, not composing the version of events that would make this easier to carry. Standing, just beginning in the first undefended moment of the morning to actually look at it, Renata Okafor finally sat down. Her knee registered its opinion about the past 40 minutes of standing. She settled into row 3B, set her book on the seat beside her, and looked at the window. Outside, the Atlanta tarmac. Gray morning, the same gray morning it had been when she boarded. Nothing had changed out there. The ground crew in their orange vests, the fuel trucks, the baggage carts, the whole machinery of ordinary transit functioning as designed. Inside this aircraft, a great deal had changed. She had been on the bench for 22 years. She had heard hundreds of cases. She had issued rulings that had affected thousands of people and institutions and policies. She had done that work carefully and believed in it genuinely. Had also, after retirement, felt the slow depletion of a life built around a role that was no longer there. The meetings that were no longer on the calendar, the deference that had been positional rather than personal, and which had departed with the position. The question, not urgent, not despairing, but persistent, of what she was now. She looked at the empty seat beside her. She thought about the woman 2 rows ahead. She thought about a phone number she was going to ask for before this aircraft landed. an organization that didn't exist yet but was going to. About 22 years of federal court experience, and what it could do in a context like this one. The legal architecture of passenger rights, the framework for institutional accountability, the language of formal complaint and formal remedy. She had a lot of that language. She thought it might be useful somewhere other than the inside of her memory. Picked up her book, did not open it, set it back down. She reached into her bag for her pen. Started making notes on the back of her boarding pass. Whitfield walked back to the cockpit. He had said what he needed to say. The calls had been made. The commitments were documented. The captain's function in this incident, both the part where he had been absent and the part where he had finally been present was, for now, complete. He sat in the left seat. His co-pilot, Chen, looked at him with the careful expression of someone who had been monitoring the situation through the cockpit door and had a number of questions he was choosing not to ask. Tower, Whitfield said, putting on his headset set. MR1247, go ahead. Ready to resume. Requesting updated departure slot. MR1247, you're looking at a 38-minute delay from original slot. New window opens in 12 minutes. Confirm readiness. Confirmed. He looked out at the runway. Long and gray and flat. The same runway he had used hundreds of times. The same instruments on the panel in front of him. The same seat worn to his specific shape from 30 years of sitting in it. Everything the same. Him, slightly different. He thought about the woman in seat 2A, about the quality of her stillness. 30 years of flight and how you develop a feel for what is actually happening versus what appears to be happening, and how he had looked at her and felt immediately that these two things were not the same, and how he had gone to verify before acting on it. Barely. He was going to think about barely for a long time. 12 minutes, he said to Chen. Ready when you are, Chen said. Whitfield looked at the instruments, at the runway, at the gray Atlanta sky beginning, somewhere far ahead, to lighten toward the west where Chicago was. He rolled his shoulders, settled into the seat. Let's get these people where they're going, he said. The aircraft began to move. Not the full movement of departure, just the preliminary shift, the slight adjustment of weight as ground crew disconnected the external power, the change in the sound of the air systems, the almost imperceptible sense of a large machine beginning to wake into its full purpose. Grace felt it through the seat. She picked up her book, found the page she had been holding with her thumb since Whitfield had come back into the cabin. Biography of Madam C.J. Walker, still a police passage about a woman who had been told by institutions and individuals and the accumulated weight of a society built to exclude her, what was and was not available to her. Proceeded as though she had not heard any of it, who had built from less than nothing, something that lasted past her own life, and shaped the lives of people who came after her. Grace had read this book twice before. She came back to it when she needed to remember something specific. Not inspiration. She was not someone who needed inspiration to keep going. Something more like calibration, the reminder that the gap between what a system tells you is possible and what is actually possible is always larger than the system wants you to know. She turned to the page she'd left off on. 2 rows back, Evelyn Marsh was looking out the window. Gerald was looking at his hands. Neither of them was speaking. Between them was the particular silence of 2 people who have been married long enough to share a silence without filling it, each doing their own interior work. Talk-free Okafor had filled 3/4 of the back of her boarding pass with notes. Her handwriting, which had been trained by decades of making annotations in the margins of legal documents, was precise and small. She had outlined a framework, not complete, just the bones of it, the legal scaffolding of what an independent passenger advocacy organization would need. Jurisdiction, intake process, reporting standards, the specific federal statutes that were relevant, the gap between what those statutes required and what carriers were currently doing. She had enough to start a conversation. She had more than enough. Marcus Webb had his phone in his hand. The voice memo app, 43 minutes and 17 seconds of ambient audio. He was composing an email in his head, working out the language for something he had never written before and wanted to get right. Garrett Stowe had his phone out. He was reading the comments under his updated post, the one he had written while the call with Reeves was happening, the correction, the acknowledgement that he had been wrong. The comments were mixed. Some people appreciated the correction. Some people were angry that it had taken this long. Some people were angry at him for posting in the first place. Reading all of them without responding to any of them, which was the right thing to do and felt extremely uncomfortable. Amber Tate was still in the galley. She had not been asked to take a jump seat. Nobody had formally directed her to do anything since the call with Reeves ended. The other flight attendant, Marcus, who had been in the rear cabin throughout and had absorbed the situation through the galley partition, had quietly taken over the forward service preparation without being asked. Done it, with the tact of someone who understood that the most useful thing he could do right now was make the practical things happen without requiring Amber to be present for them. She stood in the galley and did not move and did not reach for her phone and did not compose the version of this that would be easier to carry. She stood there and let it be what it was. Whitfield's voice came over the PA. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're cleared for taxi and have an updated departure window. We'll be getting underway momentarily. Flight time to Chicago O'Hare today is approximately 1 hour and 40 minutes. Crew, prepare the cabin for departure." The cabin began the small adjustments of preparation. Tray tables up, seat backs forward. The mechanical sounds of a cabin settling into readiness. Officer Dunbar had deplaned 10 minutes ago after a brief exchange with Whitfield near the forward door. He had said nothing to Grace on his way out. He had said nothing to Donovan either. He had walked off the aircraft with the expression of a man filing an experience away for future examination. Donovan was still on the aircraft. He had remained 2 rows back from Grace for the past several minutes, not approaching, not leaving, occupying the aisle with the uncertain quality of a man who's not yet received instructions and has lost the confidence to generate his own. He was supposed to deplane. Ground managers deplaned before pushback, but he had not moved. He looked at the back of Grace Monroe's seat. He thought about the word irregularities, how many times he had said it this morning, how it had felt authoritative when he said it, how it had seemed to function as a real thing, and how it had in fact been nothing, an empty frame with nothing inside it. A word doing the work of a reason he had not actually had. He had spent 15 years believing he could read situations. He had believed it so thoroughly that he had never really tested it, had never had a reason to. The situations had resolved the way he'd expected them to, and he had taken that as confirmation. Confirmation of what, exactly? He was beginning to understand that he had some very uncomfortable thinking to do, and that the thinking could not happen here, as an aisle, and that he needed to deplane. Walked to the front of the cabin, stopped at the door, looked back at row 2A. Grace Monroe was reading her book. He turned and walked off the aircraft. Grace became aware, in the way you become aware of something at the edge of attention for a while, that the woman in row 1D was looking at her. With hostility, not with the earlier quality of her attention, which Grace had noticed and filed without addressing because it had not yet been the moment. This was different. This was the look of someone who had arrived somewhere they did not expect to be. Their eyes met. Evelyn did not look away, which cost her something visible. Grace could seize that it cost her, in the way that honest things cost you when you do them in public, and you are the kind of person who has generally presented yourself as settled and certain. "Dr. Monroe," Evelyn said, quieter than Grace expected. "I've been sitting here trying to find the right way to say something. I think the right way is just to say it plainly." Grace waited. "When you sat down, when you first came into this cabin, I said something to my husband. Something I've said before in other situations without stopping to look at what I was actually saying, or where it came from, or what it cost." She paused, held it. "I'm not going to repeat it, but I want you to know that I know it was wrong. I want you to know that knowing it isn't enough for me. I want to do something with that knowing. I don't have the shape of it yet, but I'm going to find it." She stopped. She had said what she came to say, and she was not going to pad into something more comfortable. Grace looked at her for a long moment. She thought about what she could offer. Forgiveness accurate. She did not carry Evelyn's comment as a wound she needed tended. Correction also available. Something about the long history of inherited certainty and how it happens to good people and bad people with equal efficiency. What she said was that took something, saying it without softening it first. Notice that. Evelyn's jaw released a fraction. Something in her shoulders. "I don't know what the right something looks like either," Grace said. "Usually it starts with deciding you want to find it. Everything after that is time and effort and the willingness to be wrong about more things as you go." Evelyn nodded once. Back out the window. Gerald, who had caught most of it, patted his wife's hand. She turned hers over and held his. Like that, without speaking, which was its own language, Renata Okafor looked up from her boarding pass notes. She looked at Grace Monroe. What passed between them was not a word or a jebit, but something that functioned the way those things function. But recognition between two women who had spent their lives in rooms not designed to include them. and had sat in those rooms anyway, and had learned to read each other across distances without needing the distance explained. Renata had been in it from the beginning. Not because she had known who Grace was. She hadn't, not until the call with Reeves made the name fully clear. Because she had recognized the shape of the situation from the inside, from her own life, from 30-something years of being a black woman in spaces where the question of whether she belonged was raised by people who had not examined their authority to raise it. She had stood up because it was the only accurate response, because the alternative was witnessing something wrong and choosing the comfort of her seat over the discomfort of her voice. She had made a decision about that particular trade-off a long time ago in a different city, in a different room, and she had not revisited it since. Grace's gaze. Grace held hers. 2 seconds, no words, a full conversation in the space between them. Renata looked back at her boarding pass. The framework she was building was taking shape. She could see the outline of it now. The intake process, the legal scaffolding, the specific language that would give the organization teeth rather than just intentions. She had called enough things into existence from nothing to know that the difference between an idea and an institution was mostly a matter of showing up to do the unglamorous work of making it real. She was ready to show up for that. She had been ready for 3 years without knowing what she was ready for. Now she knew. She kept writing. The aircraft slowed briefly near the runway threshold. Standard procedure, the pause before final clearance. Grace was aware of footsteps from the rear of the cabin. Amber Tate appeared at the edge of the first-class section with the look of someone acting on a decision before they can argue themselves out of it. No phone, no prepared speech, just a person moving towards something they owed and had been standing in the galley building the courage to pay. Beside row 2, Grace looked up. "I know this doesn't fix anything," Amber said, the performance entirely gone from her voice. "Just the thing underneath it, which was smaller and more real. There's a process, and the process is going to happen. Trying to change that." Grace waited. "I want to say I'm sorry." Amber's voice was steady, which was costing her. "Because it helps me. It doesn't. But because you were in this seat doing nothing wrong, and I walked up here and decided in 3 seconds that I knew something I didn't know. Broadcast that decision to over 200 people." She stopped, then continued because she had not yet said the hardest part. "Been standing in the back of this aircraft, trying to understand how I was so certain about something so wrong. And I keep coming back to the same uncomfortable answer. I was certain because I'd been certain before, and nothing had stopped me. The system I work in told me by doing nothing that my certainty was acceptable, and I believed it." She paused. "I'm not saying that to excuse it. I'm saying it because I think it's the true thing, and I don't want to hand you a false version of what happened." Grace looked at her for a long moment, long enough that it was not comfortable, long enough to be real. "The beginning of a question is where it starts," Grace said. "Most people never get there. They stay with the certainty because examining it is harder than keeping it." "I'm not sure I get to keep it anymore," Amber said. "No," Grace said. "You don't. But what you do with that is still yours to decide." Amber held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. Small, private, the kind of nod that is made for yourself rather than for anyone watching, and went back to the galley. Grace watched her go. She thought about the word sorry and its 2 versions, the version that manages as consequences and the version that registers harm. Difference was audible if you listened for the specific quality of it, whether the speaker was trying to close something or open something. Been the second kind. She did not know what Amber Tate would do with the question she was beginning to ask. It was not Grace's to know or shape. What she knew was that real questions, the kind arrived at honestly, through discomfort, without the benefit of someone telling you the answer in advance. Those questions went somewhere, if a person was willing to follow them. Turned back to her book. The aircraft turned onto the runway. The engine note changed. The long gathering sound of thrust building. It lifted. Atlanta fell away. The gray morning, the flat geometry of the airport. The ground crew in orange vests, already small, already receding. The clouds came up, then through them. And on the other side, light, constant and available, always there for anyone willing to climb high enough. Grace looked at it for a moment, then went back to her book. She read 2 pages, then took out her phone and messaged Darnell. "Call me when I land. We have things to set in motion." She thought about Denise, about calling tonight, after Chicago, after everything, not with an agenda, just to talk. To tell her that the fuss had been made, eventually by someone who couldn't put it down. Denise already knew as it happened. Darnell had called her 3 weeks ago as part of building the complaint documentation with Grace's knowledge and Denise's consent. Denise had talked for 40 minutes, the specific words, the specific way her boarding pass had been held, the specific calculation sheets had made about whether anyone would believe her. She had said at the end, "I'm glad someone's making a record of it, even if nothing comes of it." Something was coming of it. Grace thought she was going to enjoy telling her that. Whitfield's voice came over the PA, calm as ever. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're through the cloud layer. Should be a smooth ride up to Chicago." Grace turned the page. 16 months later, Marcus Webb sat across from his friend Denzel in a spare bedroom with acoustic foam on the walls and 2 microphones on a folding table. Before recording, they listened together to all 43 minutes and 17 seconds of the cabin audio Marcus had captured that morning. Neither said much during the playback. Afterward, Denzel said, "You stood up for 2 seconds, Marcus said. Then I sat back down." "It's the part people need to hear," Denzel said. "Not the part where the CEO owned the plane. The part where a regular person stood up when it cost something and sat back down when it cost more, and has been thinking about that ever since." Marcus looked at the microphone. "Okay," he said, "let's record." The episode went up on a Thursday. By Sunday, it had more downloads than anything Denzel had published in 2 years. The comments filled with people writing, "I was on a flight once. I saw something. I looked at my hands." Marcus read everyone. He didn't respond to most of them. He didn't need to. The 43 minutes of real audio was the response. The small sounds of it, the specific way a boarding pass landed on a tray table, the voice of a retired federal judge naming what she had witnessed, existed now, outside his phone, in the world. That was what he had wanted. 1 year later, a conference room in Washington, D.C. Long table, water pitchers, working light falling on documents and prepared faces. Renata Okafor sat from the head left side. Across from her, FAA representatives, senior people from 3 carriers, passenger advocacy leads. On the table, 41 pages, passenger incident, reporting standards, and carrier rance obligations. 11 months of work. The cover page acknowledgments read, "Developed in partnership with Dignity in Transit, a 501c3 passenger advocacy organization." Organization had received its IRS status 8 months after filing. Grace had funded the first 2 years from a personal account. Monroe Aerospace's philanthropic initiative, hers, built from what had happened on one aircraft one morning. Renata uncapped her pen. Made a note on page 7. Moved to page 8. "Should we begin?" the FAA representative said. "Yes," Renata said. "Let's begin." 14 months later, the library community room, folding tables, metal chairs, 31 people, more than Evelyn had planned for, which meant Gerald brought extra chairs from storage without being asked, which she had loved about him for 49 years. She started the way she always started. "I'm 73 years old. I was on an airplane 14 months ago, and I watched something happen. First thing I did was understood it. I was wrong. That cost me something and gave me something. The chance to decide what kind of person I was going to be after being wrong." She opened the folder. Gerald, front row, watched his wife with an expression that had nothing to do with passenger rights. He had been watching her since the Monday after Chicago. Since she'd called the library, still in her coat, standing at the kitchen counter, voice carrying the specific quality of a person acting on a decision already made. He was still watching. 22 months later, Amber Tate, kitchen table, laptop, graduate program application, counseling psychology. The personal statement had been written and deleted 7 times. She was looking for the version that was honest without being self-serving, that named what she had done without making herself the protagonist of her own redemption. She didn't want to be the protagonist. She wrote about certainty, about what it costs other people when yours has not been examined. The 2 complaint records she hadn't known existed until Grace Monroe read them aloud on a speakerphone, about the man from Dallas she barely remembered, and the woman from Memphis who had moved without argument, and how that moving had felt at the time like confirmation. What confirmation was not the same as 40 minutes, no stopping, read it once, changed 4 words, submitted it. Back. Apartment quiet. Not good, exactly. Good was not the right word yet, but she felt like someone who had done a hard, necessary thing and was sitting with the weight of it rather than running from it. The beginning of something. That was enough. And Grace. Concourse B, Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, Tuesday morning. 6:47. She stood in front of the mirror. Same lights, same face, 2 years older. She adjusted the brooch. Finger. 1 second. She thought about Denise, who had heard the cabin audio in Marcus's podcast episode and called at 11 at night to say, "That's the boarding pass sound." Yes, exactly what it sounded like. A pause, then. I'm glad you didn't move. Grace had not moved. And what had grown from that, the foundation, Renata's framework, Evelyn's workshops, Marcus's episode. The 312 passengers who had filed reports through the system that now existed, all of it had started with a seat. With the decision to stay in it, she looked at herself in the mirror, 64 years old, still here. Okay, she said. The word carrying 2 years of weight it hadn't carried before. 2 years of the work continuing the way working continues, not with a finish line. Just with the next morning and the choice it offered. One more day. She picked up her bag, walked out into the light of an ordinary Tuesday, which was not ordinary at all. Which was the next thing, which was enough.